War in the Pacific was unlike anything American troops had imagined. It was not just a clash of armies, ships, and aircraft. It was a collision of wills, of doctrines, of cultures that saw battle in completely different ways. Again and again, American forces entered combat expecting familiar patterns: defensive lines, orderly retreats, measured counterattacks. And again, Imperial Japan answered with something far more shocking: sudden, violent, unpredictable. These were not just battlefield methods. They were tactics designed to stun, disorient, and break the enemy's rhythm before he could react. This ranking is about the 5 Imperial Japanese tactics that caught America off guard the most, judged not only by raw destruction, but by psychological shock, combat effectiveness, and how deeply they forced the United States to adapt. Some were born from long preparation and elite training. Others came from desperation, but all 5 left a mark on the war. At number 5 is a tactic that became legendary for its sheer ferocity: the Banzai Charge. The roots of the Banzai Charge stretched back long before World War II. Its spirit came from the Imperial Japanese Army's warrior code, shaped by Bushido ideals, emperor worship, and a culture that glorified death before surrender. But as a battlefield tactic, it became especially visible in the 1930s and 1940s, during Japan's campaigns in China and later across the Pacific. By the time American troops encountered it in full force, it was already embedded in Japanese military thinking. On paper, it was simple. When a position could no longer be held, when ammunition was low, when defeat seemed certain, Japanese commanders often chose not to retreat or surrender. Instead, they ordered a mass frontal assault: hundreds, sometimes thousands of men charging straight into enemy lines with rifles, bayonets, swords, grenades, and pure momentum. It was rarely subtle. It was meant to be overwhelming. And to Americans seeing it for the first time, it was deeply unnerving. In the dark, it could begin with shouting, then whistles, then the cry of "Tenno Heika Banzai," "Long live the Emperor." Suddenly, the jungle, the ridge, or the shattered field ahead would erupt with movement. Men came fast, screaming, firing from the hip, throwing themselves forward with a level of commitment that seemed almost suicidal. For inexperienced troops, the shock was enormous. It felt less like a normal infantry attack and more like a human wave breaking over the line. One of the earliest major examples came during the Battle of Alligator Creek on Guadalcanal in August 1942, when Colonel Kianao Ichiki led his men in a reckless night assault against entrenched U.S. Marines. The result was catastrophic for Japan. American machine guns, artillery, and disciplined fields of fire tore the charge apart. Ichiki's force was virtually annihilated. But even in failure, the attack revealed something important. Japanese troops were willing to press home assaults that many Western armies would have considered hopeless. That lesson repeated itself across the Pacific. At Saipan in 1944, the largest Banzai charge of the war crashed into American lines when Lieutenant General Yoshitsugu Saito launched a final mass assault involving thousands of soldiers, along with walking wounded and support personnel. It was one of the most desperate attacks in military history. The Americans held, but the fighting was savage, chaotic, and intimate. Entire units were overrun before the line stabilized. The attack failed militarily, but it demonstrated just how terrifying this tactic could be when unleashed at scale. The real power of the Banzai Charge was psychological. It preyed on fear, especially at night or in close terrain. In jungles, broken hills, and isolated island outposts, American troops could not always rely on visibility or distance. A determined enemy willing to die in order to close the gap turned every foxhole into a final stand. The charge could overwhelm unprepared units, expose weak points, and force defenders into panicked firing. Even when it failed, it left behind exhaustion, trauma, and a grim respect for the enemy's willingness to fight to the last man. But as the war progressed, the limits of the tactic became painfully clear. Against American automatic weapons, artillery coordination, and increasingly experienced troops, Banzai charges often became mass slaughter. They could achieve local shock, but rarely strategic success. In many cases, they destroyed valuable Japanese manpower that could have been used in more effective defense. That is why this tactic ranks 5th. It was frightening. It was memorable. It absolutely caught American forces off guard in the early stages of the war. but it was also wasteful, rigid, and ultimately unsustainable against a modern, heavily armed opponent. Still, for the men who heard those screams rising from the darkness, none of that mattered in the moment. What they faced was terror in its most direct form, an enemy not trying to survive, but trying to take you with him. And that was only number 5. If the Banzai Charge shocked Americans on land, the next tactic did something even worse at sea. It turned darkness itself into a weapon. Long before the Pacific War began, the Imperial Japanese Navy had invested heavily in one form of combat that many other navies still treated as secondary: night naval warfare. During the 1920s and 1930s, Japanese planners assumed that any future war with the United States would end in a climactic fleet battle somewhere in the Western Pacific. Since the U.S. Navy would have to cross the ocean first, Japanese doctrine focused on weakening it step by step before that final showdown. Night attacks became a critical part of that vision. This was not improvisation, it was a system. Japanese crews trained relentlessly for fighting in darkness, emphasizing formation discipline, visual signaling, torpedo coordination, and aggressive destroyer-cruiser tactics. Officers studied how to close distance unseen, launch devastating attacks, and vanish before the enemy fully understood what had happened. While many American commanders still trusted daytime gunnery and did not yet fully exploit radar early in the war, the Japanese had already built a culture around confidence in the night. And in 1942, that preparation paid off. The waters around Guadalcanal, especially the narrow stretch, later called Iron Bottom Sound, became the proving ground. There, Japanese naval forces repeatedly clashed with American ships in a series of chaotic night battles that exposed just how unready the U.S. Navy initially was. Searchlights flashed, silhouettes emerged out of black water, gunfire erupted at point-blank range, and torpedoes came slicing through the dark with almost no warning. One of the most humiliating moments came during the Battle of Savo Island on August 8 to 9, 1942. A Japanese cruiser force under Vice Admiral Gunichi Mikawa slipped through the darkness and struck the Allied screening force near Guadalcanal. In less than an hour, the Japanese sank 4 heavy cruisers: HMAS Canberra, USS Astoria, USS Quincy, and USS Vincennes, while suffering only light damage themselves. It was one of the worst defeats in U.S. naval history. For American sailors, the shock was total. This was not supposed to happen. Not like this. Ships were caught unprepared, formations broke down, and commanders struggled to understand where the attack was even coming from. Japanese gunnery was sharp, their torpedo timing superb, and their ability to coordinate in darkness far better than expected. Savo Island sent a brutal message. At night, the Japanese were more dangerous than the Americans had imagined, and it was not a one-time success. Throughout late 1942, Japanese destroyers and cruisers ran the Tokyo Express, fast nighttime reinforcement missions to Guadalcanal that doubled as opportunities to strike American naval forces. These operations showed how comfortable Japan was in the dark. They used speed, surprise, and training to keep pressure on Allied positions while avoiding many of the risks of daylight air attack. Again and again, U.S. Kunai forces found themselves reacting rather than controlling the engagement. The tactic's success came from several strengths working together. First, Japanese lookouts and crews were exceptionally trained in visual night fighting. Second, their ships, especially cruisers and destroyers, were designed to support aggressive torpedo tactics. Third, Japanese commanders tended to act boldly in darkness, trusting initiative and offensive momentum. In those early campaigns, they often seized the first strike, and in naval combat, the side that shoots first in the dark usually owns the battle. Psychologically, the effect on the U.S. Navy was severe. Night no longer felt like cover, it felt like danger. American captains knew that every black horizon might conceal destroyers racing into attack position. Sailors stood watch, knowing that one missed silhouette or one delayed order could mean sudden fire, explosions, and steel tearing open beneath their feet. The enemy seemed to move with confidence in a space where Americans often felt blind. But like the Banzai Charge, this tactic had limits, and this time technology began to shift the balance. As the war progressed, the United States improved radar integration, command procedures, and nighttime coordination. American ships became far better at detecting Japanese forces before visual contact. Training adapted, doctrine evolved. By late 1943 and 1944, the gap had narrowed sharply, and in some battles, it reversed completely. The Japanese had mastered the dark, but the Americans were learning how to see through it. That is why Japan's night naval combat doctrine takes the number 4 spot. Early in the war, it was devastating. It exposed serious American weaknesses and helped Japan dominate key surface actions. But it did not remain decisive forever. Once U.S. radar, communications, and tactical discipline matured, the darkness stopped belonging to Japan alone. Even so, in those first brutal months around Guadalcanal, American sailors learned a hard truth. Night at sea was not empty, it was occupied. And somewhere out there, beyond the black water, the Japanese were already moving. Darkness gave the Japanese Navy one edge, but its most terrifying advantage was something even harder to detect, because by the time Americans realized it was there, it was usually too late. The tactic at number 3 was built around one of the most lethal naval weapons of the entire war, the Type 93 oxygen torpedo, known to history as the Long Lance. Developed in the early 1930s and entering service before the Pacific War, the Type 93 was a masterpiece of Japanese naval engineering. While most navies used compressed air in their torpedoes, the Japanese used pure oxygen. That decision was dangerous in handling, but it produced a weapon with astonishing performance, longer range, higher speed, and a far smaller visible wake. In practical terms, it meant Japanese destroyers and cruisers could launch torpedo attacks from distances American commanders often considered impossible. And that changed everything. In the early Pacific War, the U.S. Navy still tended to think of torpedoes as relatively short-range weapons used at closer engagement distances. Japanese doctrine shattered that assumption. Their ships did not just carry powerful torpedoes, they were trained to use them offensively in coordinated spreads, often before opening gunfire. That meant American vessels could be struck before their crews even understood they were in torpedo range. The result was confusion, disbelief, and devastation. At the Battle of Tasafaranga on November 30, 1942, a Japanese destroyer force under Rear Admiral Raizo Tanaka faced an American task force near Guadalcanal. On paper, the Americans held the advantage. They had more ships and radar support, but the Japanese executed a disciplined torpedo attack that turned the battle upside down. In a matter of minutes, USS Northampton was sunk, while USS Minneapolis, USS New Orleans, and USS Pensacola were heavily damaged. One Japanese destroyer was lost. The exchange was staggering. To American officers, it seemed almost unreal. How had the Japanese hit so hard, so fast, from so far away? The answer was doctrine. Japanese crews were trained to make torpedoes the opening blow, not the afterthought. They treated them as battle-winning weapons. Cruisers and destroyers maneuvered with launch opportunities in mind. They understood angles, timing, night approach, and massed salvo tactics. In many engagements, American ships sailed straight into carefully prepared killing zones without knowing it. And unlike shellfire, torpedoes brought a special kind of terror. A shell might miss. A shell might hit and still allow a ship to fight on, but a torpedo strike could rip open a hull below the waterline, kill power, ignite fuel, flood engineering spaces, and doom a warship in minutes. Even when it did not sink a ship outright, it could cripple it beyond recovery. There was also the mental burden. You usually did not see the attack happen. There was no warning roar overhead, no muzzle flash to track, just an impact, a violent tearing blow from beneath the sea. That invisibility gave the Long Lance tactic its psychological power. American sailors could not easily defend against what they could not reliably detect. They began to realize that Japanese surface forces were not merely bold, they were carrying a hidden reach far beyond expectation. Every night action, every cruiser engagement, every destroyer contact now carried the fear of unseen torpedoes already in the water. This tactic also amplified Japan's early war naval successes. It helped compensate for industrial inferiority by making smaller surface forces disproportionately dangerous. A well-handled Japanese destroyer squadron could threaten much heavier American formations. In confined waters like the Solomons, that mattered enormously. It allowed Japan to contest the sea with far greater lethality than its overall numbers might suggest. But this tactic, too, had a shelf life. As the war wore on, the United States improved radar, combat information procedures, maneuver discipline, and damage control. American commanders became more cautious about torpedo threats and less likely to assume safety at longer ranges. Air power also changed the game. Japanese surface forces found it harder and harder to reach favorable attack positions under growing Allied pressure. And while the long lance remained deadly, Japan increasingly lacked the strategic freedom to exploit it the way it had in 1942. That is why this tactic ranks number 3. It was brilliant, innovative, and deeply damaging in the early to middle phases of the Pacific Naval War. It caught America off guard, not just because the weapon was superior, but because the doctrine behind it was smarter and more aggressive than expected. The Japanese did not simply have a better torpedo. They had a better idea of how to terrify an enemy with it. For American sailors in the Solomons, the ocean itself started to feel hostile. The dark water was no longer just a battlefield. It was an ambush. And above the sea, a far more horrifying tactic was still waiting to appear. By late 1944, the war had turned against Japan. Its navy was bleeding, its veteran aviators were dying faster than they could be replaced, and American industry was producing ships, planes, and pilots on a scale Japan could no longer match. Conventional tactics were failing. The old methods, night attacks, torpedo ambushes, even elite carrier aviation, were no longer enough to stop the American advance. So Japan turned to something far darker. At number 2 is the Kamikaze Strategy, a tactic born in 1944, formalized during the desperate defense of the Philippines, and remembered as one of the most shocking methods of warfare ever used. The word kamikaze, meaning divine wind, echoed the typhoons that had once saved Japan from Mongol invasion. This time, the wind would come from the sky, pilots deliberately crashing explosive-laden aircraft directly into American ships. It was not the first suicide attack in military history, but Japan transformed it into a large-scale operational doctrine. The first organized special attack units appeared during the Battle of Leyte Gulf in October 1944 under Vice Admiral Takejiro Onishi. Japan's logic was brutally simple. If its pilots could no longer reliably defeat the U.S. Navy in conventional air combat, they could still turn every aircraft into a guided bomb. A damaged fighter that missed with a normal bomb might achieve nothing, but a pilot aiming his entire plane at the flight deck of a carrier or the bridge of a destroyer could still kill hundreds, ignite aviation fuel, and knock a warship out of action. And for the Americans, this was something entirely new. Normal air attacks followed familiar patterns. A bomber might dive, release, and pull away. A torpedo plane might line up and break off. Defensive fire could disrupt the attack. Pilots could lose nerve. But the kamikaze removed that last margin of safety. These attackers were not trying to survive. They were trying to die on target. That changed the psychology of naval warfare overnight. A conventional pilot might flinch under anti-aircraft fire. A kamikaze pilot often flew straight through it. American gunners who had trained to force enemy planes away suddenly faced attackers who grew more dangerous the closer they came. Even a crippled Japanese aircraft, trailing smoke and flames, might still slam into a deck in its final seconds. There was no safe assumption, no comforting idea that the enemy would break away. The tactic proved devastating during the Philippines campaign, then even more terrifying during the Battle of Okinawa in 1945, where kamikaze attacks reached their most intense and systematic form. Waves of suicide aircraft targeted destroyers, radar picket ships, transports, carriers, and battleships. American ships could fend off dozens of attackers and still be destroyed by one that got through. The numbers were shocking. Hundreds of U.S. ships were damaged during the Okinawa campaign, and dozens were sunk or rendered combat ineffective by suicide attacks. Destroyers on radar picket duty suffered especially heavily. Positioned far from the main fleet to provide early warning, they became exposed bait for incoming Japanese aircraft. Crews aboard those ships endured a special kind of hell: hours of tension, sudden alarms, walls of anti-aircraft fire, then the sight of a plane still coming straight at them through smoke. And that was the true power of the kamikaze strategy, not just the destruction, but the relentless mental pressure. It exhausted the fleet. It forced commanders to rethink layered air defense, radar warning, combat air patrol patterns, picket deployment, and shipboard damage control. It made every radar contact a possible death sentence. It strained nerves at every level, from bridge officers to anti-aircraft gunners to damage control teams waiting below deck. A battleship could survive shells, a carrier could survive near misses, but a plane crashing into a fuel-filled flight deck with suicidal precision was something else entirely. This tactic also carried symbolic force. It showed just how far Japan was willing to go. To American observers, the kamikaze was both horrifying and deeply unsettling because it suggested an enemy embracing annihilation as policy. It was not only a military tactic. It was a message. Japan would keep fighting even when logic said the war was lost. Yet despite all its terror, the kamikaze strategy could not reverse the outcome of the war. It inflicted terrible damage, but it consumed aircraft, fuel, and lives that Japan could not replace. It was strategically desperate, not strategically sustainable. It hurt the United States badly, but it did not stop the advance. That is why it ranks number 2. Few tactics shocked America more. Few forced the U.S. Navy to adapt so urgently. Few created such a lasting image of fear in the Pacific War. But one Japanese tactic still stands above it, not because it was more fanatical, but because its surprise was so complete, its execution so precise, and its impact so immediate that it changed the entire war in a single morning. And that final tactic began before most Americans even knew they were at war. Before Banzai Charges shook jungle battlefields, before long-lance torpedoes haunted black water, before kamikazes turned the sky into a weapon, Imperial Japan unveiled the tactic that caught the United States more completely than any other: the Pearl Harbor Strike Plan. Its origins took shape in 1940 and 1941, as relations between Japan and the United States deteriorated under the pressure of sanctions, oil embargoes, and Japan's expanding war in Asia. Japanese leaders understood a hard truth. If war came, America's industrial power would eventually become overwhelming. Japan could not hope to outbuild the United States in a long conflict, so its opening move had to do something extraordinary: cripple the U.S. Pacific Fleet at the very start, buy time for Japanese expansion, and shock Washington badly enough to weaken the American will to fight. That was the theory. The architect most closely associated with the plan was Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, Commander-in-Chief of the combined fleet. Yamamoto knew America well enough to fear its industrial strength, but he also believed that a sudden concentrated carrier strike might give Japan a vital window of opportunity. The concept itself was radical. Instead of waiting for the U.S. fleet to cross the Pacific, Japan would bring the war directly to Hawaii. It would rely on speed, secrecy, carrier aviation, and precise coordination on a level the world had never seen. And on the morning of December 7, 1941, it worked. 6 Japanese aircraft carriers launched the attack force. Hundreds of planes, torpedo bombers, level bombers, dive bombers, and fighters approached Oahu in carefully organized waves. Their mission was not random destruction. It was a calculated blow aimed at battleships, airfields, aircraft on the ground, and the overall combat readiness of the Pacific Fleet. Japan sought not merely to damage America, but to stun it. The success of the tactic depended on surprise, and that surprise was nearly total. American commanders did not expect a carrier strike of that scale from that distance. The approach route across the North Pacific helped conceal the attack. Radio silence preserved secrecy. Timing was meticulous. The assault came on a Sunday morning when readiness was lower and many personnel were off guard. Aircraft were lined up wingtip to wingtip on airfields, partly to prevent sabotage, making them perfect targets for air attack. Battleships sat moored in predictable positions. In a matter of minutes, what had been a peacetime anchorage became an inferno. USS Arizona exploded catastrophically. USS Oklahoma capsized. Multiple battleships were sunk or heavily damaged. Airfields such as Hickam, Wheeler, and Ford Island were hit hard. American aircraft were destroyed before many could even take off. The visual shock was enormous: smoke rising over the harbor, burning ships, shattered hangars, men diving into oil-covered water, anti-aircraft fire erupting too late to stop the first wave. This was not only a tactical success, it was a psychological masterpiece. For Americans, the most terrifying part was not simply the damage. It was the realization that the attack had come from nowhere, across an ocean thought to provide security, against a fleet believed safe at anchor by a carrier force that had struck with precision and vanished. In one morning, the United States learned that distance no longer guaranteed protection. The Pacific was no barrier. It was now a highway for war. Militarily, the attack temporarily achieved much of what Japan wanted. It crippled the American battleship force at Pearl Harbor and gave Japan freedom of action for its early offensives across Southeast Asia and the Pacific. In the months that followed, Japanese forces swept through the Philippines, Malaya, the Dutch East Indies, and beyond. The strike plan had bought time, but only time. Its greatest strategic failure lay in what it did not destroy. America's aircraft carriers were not in port. Pearl Harbor's repair facilities, fuel storage, and industrial infrastructure survived. Most importantly, the attack did not break American resolve. It ignited it. Rather than forcing hesitation, Pearl Harbor unified the United States with extraordinary speed and fury. The very shock that made the tactics so effective in the moment also guaranteed that the war would become a national crusade. That is why Pearl Harbor ranks #1 on this list. No other Imperial Japanese tactic caught America so completely off guard. No other strike matched its combination of surprise, coordination, scale, and historic consequence. Kamikaze attacks terrified the fleet. Long-lance torpedoes haunted the sea. Night fighting embarrassed American commanders. Banzai Charges stunned troops in the field. But Pearl Harbor changed everything in a single blow. It was the tactic that opened the Pacific War with fire, smoke, and disbelief. The tactic that proved Japan could plan and execute a modern surprise attack at the highest level. And the tactic that, for a few terrible hours, made the United States look vulnerable before the entire world. Those were the 5 Imperial Japanese tactics that caught America off guard the most. The shock of the Banzai Charge, the mastery of night combat, the invisible reach of the long lance, the terror of the kamikaze, and the devastating precision of Pearl Harbor. Together, they revealed the strengths and the desperation of an empire determined to fight with surprise, aggression, and psychological force. Some won battles, one changed history, but in the end, all of them also forced America to adapt, evolve, and come back harder. And if you've stayed until this final moment, thank you. If you want to keep exploring events like this, deeper, more real, make sure to like the video and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss what comes next. Thank you for watching.